Okay, I think we can start. Just a couple of minutes after 3 hour time. Today we have as a guest Anna Valero, that we thank very much for her participation. Anna Valero is the Growth Program Director of the London School of Economics Center for Economic Performance. She's well known, and she has worked on several issues which are related to the topics of today's presentation, and also, of course, on the topics of today's presentation. She has worked extensively on such issues as innovation and diffusion, sustainable growth, but her talk today will be on the economic impact of the universities. The general topics of this webinar series is the role of universities in the cities or in the metropolitan areas. So I don't know whether, Anna, you can especially focus on universities in large cities. After all, you work at the London School of Economics, so of course your primary field of observation is a mega city like London, and so of course your empirical observation, I assume, will be especially from such an experience. But it is up to you. I still want to remind that Anna, together with John van Reenen, I hope the pronunciation is right, has published extensively on the economic impact of universities. The last article, if I am correct, is from 2019. Is that correct, on this issue? But you had previous articles and reports on the same issues. So it is a sort of a time series of studies that you have done on these topics, and this is why we are especially interested in listening to what you have to tell us about these topics. The discussant will be Daniele Checchi, who is working on labor economics and economics of education at the University of Milan. So he will be your discussant. Now, Anna, it's up to you, and thanks again very much for having accepted our invitation.
Thank you very much, Marino. Let me share my screen and make sure you can see the right view. Is that okay? Thank you very much for the kind invitation to contribute to your seminar series and for the kind introduction too. So I'm going to talk about the economic impact of universities. As you say, because universities tend to be quite often in urban centres, not always. A lot of our great universities are, in any case. A lot of the results we talk about will apply to cities. I would say that in the UK, of course, there are places like Cambridge, that's a small urban area, but that is kind of one of the key clusters, innovation clusters globally. So we'll touch on kind of differences across urban, rural as we get to them. So let me just scroll. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll kind of introduce the topic and this research agenda generally. I'm then going to talk a little bit, maybe about a third of the presentation on that paper with John van Reenen, because it's quite a general, global, historical paper, and it kind of gives the framework that has then informed kind of other work that I've been doing on the same agenda, going specifically into some elements of this, looking at mechanisms more closely. So then I'll talk about how universities, via producing skills, are kind of also aiding with technology adoption in firms. So I'll talk there about a paper that's published, as well as some other work in progress on these topics. And then go into universities and innovation more on the invention side. So thinking a little bit about things like high-tech startups, which are a way of measuring or monitoring innovation in the economy, and also some work on patents as well, which is more work in progress. And finally, I'll conclude with what this means for policy. But in the Q&A, I'm happy to go into things in more detail if I don't give them enough depth in the presentation. So to introduce, obviously this audience knows that universities tend to be key players in national and in local growth strategies. This is because they are producers of human capital. More skilled individuals are more innovative. They're often seen as complements to technologies and aiding the adoption of technologies in firms. More skilled individuals are just more productive themselves as well. So just in their own work, but the innovation input that they provide generates these externalities, so human externalities, and this is one of the key reasons why policymakers support investment in human capital. Obviously, universities are also producing research, and a lot of that research then flows into commercialized innovations, generating growth. And there's an increased focus on the third mission, so leading to tech transfer, incubators, spin-offs, spin-outs, and a focus on these activities in universities. A really nice book, Research Universities and the Public Good by Jason Owen Smith in the US. This highlights how universities are sources of discovery, regional institution, which can be thought of as anchors, and also hubs of bringing lots of different actors, stakeholders, disciplines, and views together. So they're being uniquely placed to help us answer future global challenges. So this is the kind of motivation for why we've been working on this. There's clearly a geographic dimension here, because what we've seen repeatedly internationally is that you'll have these innovation clusters which surround universities, whether it's in Silicon Valley or the Cambridge cluster in the UK, which I mentioned. Actually, if you see the World Intellectual Property Organization, they do their annual Global Innovation Index. In the top 3 innovation clusters, which they measure as kind of patent and publication intensity, Oxford and Cambridge are both in the top 3 globally. So these are successful clusters. But it's hard to prove the causal relationships. Is it the university, or is it that's driving the industry and the success in the industry, or is it success in industry that strengthens the university? And of course, it's difficult to manufacture such clusters out of nowhere. There are path dependencies at play. So today's presentation will include some insights from different projects, all of which have a regional or even sub-regional local focus. The first one, as I said, is the paper with John Van Reenen. Then I'll talk through university skills technology adoption with one of the papers already published in the Economic Journal, and then universities in innovation, which will be more work in progress. So the big question here is, are universities ivory towers, kind of sources of lots of great academic research, but not necessarily contributing to the local economy and somehow not interacting with the local economy? Or are they more engines of growth? I think based on what I've said already, you probably can guess where I will argue that this is. But of course, there's heterogeneity across universities, across places, and that's really interesting. The relevant literature, which I think surrounds and motivates this, which I hope we contribute to, is the extensive literature on regional human capital and development, and also growth, more the macro regressions, the macro literature. Then there's also the whole literature on human capital spillovers in firms and wages. So Moretti had 2 very well-known papers in 2004 that consider those 2 elements. I have a Routledge Economics of Education Handbook chapter that really summarizes that literature, but then all the other more micro-founded analyses, more using firm-level data, individual-level data, etc. Then there's the separate literature on university research and localized innovation spillovers, which stems from Jaffe, his seminal study. Some recent studies, which I think are really interesting, consider patenting outcomes with nice causal designs. So there's Mike Andrews, his paper is now published in the AEJ Economic Policy, which looks at land-grant colleges in the US and links that to patenting. And then the Pfister et al. Paper, which is looking at University of Applied Sciences in Switzerland, where there was a kind of, the way they were established enables a difference in difference kind of approach, and that is also linked to patenting. Some papers link university research activity to local economic outcomes, and they find that effects are stronger when university research is technologically closer to local industry. So Cantor and Wally, they look at research spending on local economies. Naomi Hausman looks at the impacts of university innovation on employment, wages, and corporate innovation, following a regulatory change in the US. So to go through this paper, the global paper, a summary of the paper is basically our research question here was, what is the economic impact of universities on regional and also national economies? At that point, when we started working on this, we'd come across this very interesting database, the World Higher Education Database, which had really holistic data on universities all around the world. And I'll come to the data in a minute. But at that point, I mean, I think obviously there's more research as time goes by, but still there's relatively little research that explicitly looks at the impacts of universities themselves as institutions with all their different functions on regional economic outcomes. The approach we took here was regional growth regressions. What we did was we took a kind of macro approach here, but at the region level, and we added growth in university numbers and the relevant controls. The data we use, as I mentioned, this World Higher Education Database, and we linked that to regional economic data since the 1950s, which we accessed from Gianelli et al.'s Growth in Regions paper. And then we brought in various other data sets as well. So this enabled us to do lots of really nice descriptive statistics. So we documented 1,000 years of university growth. You can see here the first university, the University of Bologna in 1088. And then we've marked here the years where the number of universities in the world doubles. There's a literature in economic history that links universities to the commercial revolution, firstly, and then the industrial revolution. And of course, what we see here is a rapid growth in the 20th century. And this really, we discussed in the paper, also looking at the sociology literature here, there was this shift in the recognition of the importance of human capital across society, not just for an elite few, for equity reasons, but also there's a recognition of the importance of human capital in terms of an input into science, technology, innovation. Particularly, we talk quite a lot about the Sputnik crisis following World War II, and this kind of race for technology, which required also expansion of university sectors and research activity. So how can universities impact on their local and national economies? So I talked about this a bit, but there's the highly skilled labour aspect, which has a direct impact, and then also the indirect impact through externalities. Their locations of R&D activity with the academics, the research staff producing innovations, often in collaboration with industry, or graduates producing innovations through spin-offs or other local firms. Spatial elements here through agglomeration economies and knowledge spillovers, which again, it's these knowledge spillovers and externalities associated with R&D that justify government support, particularly for public R&D, where it's more meant to be a public good, as opposed to, governments also provide incentives for private R&D because there are still spillovers. But particularly when it comes to university R&D, those spillovers tend to be higher. There's the demand channel. It could be just, these are large institutions, many people work there, students come and live there. Is it just direct consumption and multiplier effects of these institutions? And then there's universities as institutions themselves having broader socioeconomic impacts. Maybe it's through convening local industry, local policymakers, having events on a growth strategy for a region, being involved in formulating a growth strategy for a region. So that's something we touch on in the paper as well. So the data, the World Higher Education Database, our measure of what a university is here was an institution that offers at least a postgraduate degree or a 4-year professional diploma. So this was the set of higher quality institutions, and there are about 16,000 of them in the World Higher Education Database, and we used vintage from 2010. The key variables we used were the location, because we wanted to geolocate these firms. We mapped them to a region in this paper, but another paper I'm going to talk about, we used their precise coordinates. We used their founding date, and this was really the key piece of information here to have any time variation. We calculated the universities present in regions over time based on when they were founded. Now, the validity of this approach rests on exit being rare, because of course we're taking a list in 2010. Maybe there'd been loads of other universities which weren't in the list in 2010. And what we actually did was quite a painstaking process. I was doing my PhD at the time, so I had time to do this. I went back and found historical handbooks which were the kind of manual version of this World Higher Education database, and basically got all of those institutions and checked if they still exist to this day. Sometimes that was quite easy to do. Other times there had been name changes, there'd been mergers. I had to enlist help from people, for example, in Russia, because it was the former Soviet Union. There'd been many name changes. But basically, we found that exit is incredibly rare. These institutions are rarely just shut down. Maybe they change or they're merged, but they don't cease to exist completely overall. So we have information on the subjects, the qualifications offered, and this enables heterogeneity analysis. And our sample in the end was a set of regions that we could map to economic data. So we have a sample of nearly 15,000 universities mapped to 1,500 regions in 78 countries. And this is over the period 1950 to 2010. And that, so basically up till around just after the financial crisis, and it covers over 90% of GDP at that later date. So we were able to do various descriptors, as I mentioned. Here is a kind of visual sense check of the Joel Mokir's hypothesis that the building and dissemination of knowledge played a key role in industrialization. You can see here that university growth starts picking up, kind of slightly as on the right-hand side, you can see universities normalized by population starts picking up actually before you then see GDP rising more rapidly. So that's maybe a visual sense check of that. Here's Italy, which shows a contrast actually that there was much less growth for some time. And in fact, the density fell and then started rising later after the 1950s. The basic relationships that we find in the data are that there is this lots of positive country level cross-sectional correlations, as you'd expect, between our university measures, GDP growth, human capital, patents. At the regional level, which is what motivates us to then go into more robust specifications, we see this positive relationship between GDP per capita growth and the growth in the number of universities. On the left-hand side, that's a simple long difference, one observation per region. On the right-hand side, that's using 5-year periods, and that's kind of more based on the specification that we'll have. And again, you can see this positive relationship. It's not driven by outliers. We do various things to show that this is relatively robust correlation that justifies further research. The underlying model that we're basically basing our analysis, or what we're interested in, is understanding the relationship between GDP per capita and universities controlling for population. And so alpha 1 here, that's the percentage increase in regional GDP per capita following percentage increase in the number of universities. And elasticity, this captures diminishing returns of an additional university, because clearly if you've already got many universities, adding one more represents a smaller proportional increase. And we use the fifth lag in our empirical application because we consider it will take time for effects to build, but we check different lag structures. But our empirical strategy, our key estimating equation, is that we kind of take differences of all of this. So we're basically sweeping out fixed effects. We add in lots of covariates at the regional level, things like geographic variables and other things. I think we've got oil production, etc. We have region fixed effects as well, year fixed effects. And again, we're clustering standard errors at the region level here. Of course, you might still be worried about endogeneity, and we do a number of things to try and address that. So we lag university growth. We also have population to control for demand shocks that might happen that lead lots of more people to move to a region. We show that reverse causality doesn't seem to drive the results. We have a number of case studies where we argue that in general, the post-World War II expansions in many countries were not driven by economic conditions, but rather they were national policies driven by social equity and the Cold War response. For example, in the UK, there was actually these plate glass universities, places like Warwick and Sussex, that were seeking greenfield sites to establish them rather than just going to already successful city centres, for example. But of course, we can't address concerns of time-varying unobservables, so please take these associations to be suggestive rather than definitive. These are results. There won't be too many tables in today's presentation, but this is just to show the kind of turquoise highlighted one. That's our kind of core specification. where it shows, but across the different specifications, there's a positive, there's a significant relationship between the lagged growth in universities and regional growth of GDP per capita. And you can see that in our main specification, we've got year dummies, country dummies, region controls, region trends. We're not doing country by year dummies. That was a bit taking out so much of a variation. But our main result is basically that it appears that universities are boosting growth. A 10% rise in the number of universities is associated with 0.4% higher GDP per capita in that same region. We think this might even be an underestimate because actually, obviously, it would likely take time, and we explore this in the paper, for these effects to build further, and we're being quite conservative with this 5-year period. But our results are robust to a range of specification checks and different samples. Of course, not all universities are the same, and these data are quite crude. First of all, we just have whether or not there's a university there. We don't have data over annually of the size of all these different universities. And obviously quality varies too. Again, to have data on rankings or something for every university over this entire period would be great. But our proxies that we're able to use were things like subject mix or whether or not they're PhD granting. So on size, what we try and do is we kind of took the US. There's kind of 50 states there, so it's enough observations to look at if we use enrollments data, would we get something similar? And we actually find that the levels and the growth are correlated with university numbers in terms of enrollments. And if you were to put enrollments into the in the regressions of the similar format that we're putting university numbers, we get similar results. I'll tell you later about the UK project, which uses enrollments as well. On quality, we find that the results really apply to all universities. There's some evidence that STEM intensity, so more science, technological, maths, the subjects seem to matter more, and research universities seem to matter more in advanced economies. There are also geographical spillover effects. So column 1 here is just that core result which you saw before. Column 2 puts in the nearest region. And then it shows that there's a positive effect of the nearest region, but that declines if the nearest region is very far. So there's a spatial element to this. And then the column 3 shows that if you take the university growth in all other regions in the country, that even also benefits you as a region too. So there's this spillover effect, which we then use to kind of size all of this into a country level benefit and cost. So with some calculations, which are explained in the paper, we calculate that if you were to add one university to the average region in the average country of our data set, the country level set effect would be around 0.05% uplift to GDP per capita. And then we do a UK thought experiment, which in the paper we argue you could do in any country context based on the costs or some data on costs. We do an experiment. What if you were to add one university to each UK region in 2010? For each region, based on the number of universities there were, we calculate what would be the own region effect and the spillover effect to all the other regions. And we calculate the benefits at the country level. If you'd done that, would be 0.7% higher GDP, which was around 11.3 billion in 2010. The costs are not going to be fully captured in our regression framework, so we use average university expenditures to estimate the annual cost if you were to do this hypothetical expansion. And it seems these costs are a lot lower, about 0.1% of GDP. So we argue that the benefits outweigh the costs. We then look at mechanisms. I'm just checking for time. I should rush through this to get onto the other papers. Mechanisms, we say this isn't just a demand effect. And we do this by controlling for population and population growth, because demand, if it was just demand, then actually it's all those people moving into the region that are driving it. But if we're controlling for that, we argue that that should address that concern. But we also do a simulation. If you were to open university with reasonable assumptions, which are actually we're quite generous with our assumptions, and try and calculate what would be the impact. We say, well, even if you did that, and I won't go through all of these steps, but you could maybe explain about 15% of our university coefficient. So yes, demand could matter, but it's not explaining everything away. We then look at human capital in innovation by adding human capital and innovation or patenting measures into our regressions and seeing how much our main effect goes down. And we find that adding human capital reduces our university coefficient by 8%. Adding in innovation in terms of growth in patenting, that reduces it by 20%. But of course, these are imperfect measures of skills in the workforce and of innovation, because patenting doesn't reflect all innovation. So it's likely that there are things we can't account for. And I'll talk about management practices, another type of innovation, and show that maybe that's part of this too. Institutions. So we are controlling for country and region fixed effects. So our university story isn't simply the fact that you've got universities, but you've also got stronger institutions in these regions and these countries. So that would control for time invariant institutions. But of course, institutions do vary over time. It's hard to get a regional data set that has a measure of how institutions change over time on this period across the entire world. So what we do here is a slightly different approach, where we look at world values survey perceptions of democracy. So we do individual level regressions here. And we find that lagged universities matter for people's perceptions of democracy over and above their own education. So yes, your own education matters, but there's something else about having universities in your region that perhaps reflects a diffusion of ideas. Okay, so in conclusion, robust associations between university growth and regional economic growth, but we need more work and different data to understand mechanisms. And so I'm going to talk a bit about technology adoption, maybe as a mechanism. So universities producing skills and enabling technology adoption. And then obviously these data are crude, they're international and available over time. Within country analyses can shed more light on the intensive margins, so how universities are growing or changing, and exploit richer data both on universities and also on the kind of economic outcomes. So rather than working with regional GDP per capita, we can work with firm level productivity or firm level entry and exit and other things, and also find causal designs in particular contexts. So I'll talk about the UK paper and some work in progress there. So on university skills and technology adoption, this is some work which was published in the Economic Journal, and we're arguing it's basically like a skill-biased technology argument, but applied to management as an organizational technology, which is that we know that management practices matter for firm productivity. So from the literature that's began with Bloom and Van Reen in 2007. It's quite established now that management practices matter for productivity, but we still don't fully understand why we see differences across firms in terms of their management practices. There are a number of papers now that shed light on different mechanisms, but one thing that seems to matter is human capital. So the starting point of our paper is the fact that you find this very strong correlation between firm skills and firm management practices, even when you control for sectors and firm characteristics. And this paper explores that, but tries to address endogeneity concerns by taking skills measures outside the firm. So availability of skills, the price of skills, to provide evidence that skills and management practices are complements. So we use manufacturing plants in the World Management Survey, and we use universities in the World Higher Education Database, which now we're using their precise location across 19 countries, plus other skills measures. So we went into 13 countries' labour force surveys or equivalent and ran regional wage regressions to get measures of skill premia and to calculate the availability of skills. The empirical strategy that we're trying to follow here can be described schematically from, you've got universities in region K, and they impact on your skill supply in region K, which then impacts on the skills price in region K. That then influences human capital in firm I in region K, and the human capital in firm I region K affects management practices in that same firm. And ideally, you would have consistent data to investigate all of this, but data available at different levels. So what we do, so this is the starting point, the firm level. So the last bit here, HIK to MIK, this is a really robust correlation between firm skills and management practices, but endogenous, even when you control for various things. What we find is getting, for each firm, calculating the distance between it and its closest university, we find that, and then controlling for region fixed effects and other things, we find that firms closer to universities are better managed and have a more skilled workforce. And that's what's shown here in these downward sloping curves. Separate analysis using the regional skill premia, where we have to work at the region level, or we have to locate firms in regions and look at the relationship between this regional skill premium and management practices, find similar downward sloping relationships. So when firms are facing more expensive skills or more scarce skills. They're less well managed and they have fewer skilled workers. So we suggest that it's this variation in the price of skills that is driving this thing that we see here. And then separately in the paper, we also show that places with more universities have a lower price of skills, so more abundant skills. So this is a way of thinking about universities influencing what we organizational technology adoption in firms by the provision of skills. But of course, we can't rule out that they're also doing other things. So maybe not over all countries, all periods, but for example, in the UK now, there's a business support program called Help to Grow Management that universities across the country are providing, working with local firms. So we talk about an IV strategy in this paper, but we can't rule out, you know, in the exclusion restriction, we can't say that there aren't other channels through which universities are also impacting on management practices in firms. So in some sense, our reduced form relationships are also really interesting in their own right. So in other current work, and here I'll be really, really brief, we're looking at skills as a driver of digital technology adoption. And this is work with a number of co-authors, including Anna Rosso, who you might know, she's at the University of Insubria. So what this does is it traces the adoption of digital technologies in firms and regions using text analysis of job ads. So we can see when job ads are mentioning cloud or machine learning and AI, and we take that as a measure of that firm adopting a technology. And then we have the previous wave, which we call the first wave in our project, which is PC adoption, so personal computer adoption in the early 2000s. And what we find, and using, so Beaudry, Doms and Lewis in the US, they have this paper that relates lagged skill availability to PC adoption in that first wave. So we kind of replicate that in a sense in the UK for the first wave, and then we do the second wave and find similar relationships. So general human capital 10 years before influences adoption in places in the UK. But actually we also add in STEM skills, and we find that they seem to matter even more. So more technological skills matter more in this latest wave for things like cloud and machine learning and AI. And so here's just a depiction of that. We've got the first wave, the PC adoption, and this is travel to work areas. The really big one there is London. You can see that even if you drop London, you still have an effect, or if you control for London, Oxford and Cambridge, you still have an effect. And so PC adoption, there's this positive relationship. Cloud in 2019 and machine learning AI in 2019, also positive relationships with lagged skills. And we putting this into regressions, it's very interesting. There's path dependencies, but these relationships, so say you have cloud in 2019 or machine learning AI in 2019, controlling for how much PC adoption you did in the previous wave, the skills still matter. So it's kind of an interesting result, and this is something we should have the working paper quite soon. And if I have time for the kind of last section is universities and innovation, more on the invention side, or kind of the new ideas coming to market side. This paper, The Local Economic Impact of Universities, Evidence from UK Firms. So the reason this is still an LSE Mimio, this was kind of a sole authored paper of my PhD. And since I wrote it, there were lots of changes in the admin data that it rests on, and we're trying to get it all set up again. For example, I was heavily using the postcode in this project, and for data security reasons, they wanted to remove the postcode. So now everything has to be redone in a less precise way. I was also using data on firm level productivity and other things, and that data, they had problems and they're going to revamp it. So there will soon be a new version of this paper, but I think some of the general results are kind of interesting. So I wanted to just highlight a couple of things. And in some sense, it addresses concerns or gaps in that global paper, because you can get more precise and look at more specific elements of universities if you go into a specific country with richer data. So what this paper does is it estimates the effect of university growth at the intensive margin, so in terms of enrollments, which is a proxy of the size of the universities, on local industrial performance and composition. And this is over the period 1997 to 2016. So this was a time of rapid expansion of universities on the intensive margin in the UK. Also some new universities cropping up, but this one is focused very much on existing universities growing. So the focus is on high-tech firms and on the entry of high-tech firms, so startups. These are particularly important for growth in advanced economies like the UK, and there are lots of policies trying to encourage this. The most recent iteration is these investment zones around universities that the government has implemented, where it's trying to build these clusters or to build on existing clusters further through targeted spatial policies. So it uses admin data and survey data on UK firms and universities. And what I do is I find positive, significant relationships between university growth and high-tech startups in local areas, which are wards, around 8,000 of them, electoral wards in the UK. I also look at employment effects. Those are more muted, although there do seem to be, so in existing smaller firms, they seem to grow when universities grow. And I looked at the productivity effects, but I would be very caveated on that because the data had some issues. But there were productivity effects, particularly in the areas that are high-tech intensive. So again, there's a heterogeneity here in terms of the types of results, but this basically depicts the university measure. So the way I did this was I took these small local areas, and then the exposure to universities measure was how many students are currently enrolled within a 30-kilometer radius of the centroid of that small local area. And you can see that picture in the most recent 2016 in the university data I had at that point. And then you can see how that changed from 1995 to 2016. So there was growth in quite a few places. And I experimented with different radius and other measures here. And so this depicts the positive significant relationship between university growth and high-tech startups, which was particularly strong for research-intensive institutions. So that's the result I have here. A quick proxy for that was Russell Group students. So that's kind of the more research-intensive group of universities, but there were other ways of looking at this through subjects or PhD status. But also the effects were stronger for areas with higher initial human capital. So this is really reflecting this kind of path dependence, and it's often already the areas that have higher skills, more absorptive capacity, and it's the higher quality institutions perhaps that have the most impacts as they grow. So basically, again, this paper doesn't necessarily say much about the mechanisms. It could be via the skills, so just those workers staying and being productive and opening businesses, or it could explicitly be due to spin-offs or spin-outs, or it could simply be that these clusters of growing universities, more students in an area, more skilled people and researchers are attractive to businesses to come and set up a site. So I can't say much about that. I hope to in future work. We also explore quite a topical issue, which is the share of overseas students in the universities. And for that, we actually can have a nice instrumental variable strategy based on a shift share of composition. And I think we might take that forwards more in this next iteration, particularly given Brexit and a lot of debates about immigration policy, and some areas are kind of being more restrictive now on overseas students. That could really contribute to the debate. But other current work we're doing at the university level on innovation is on a project called Spillovers from Science, where what we're doing is we're linking academic publications into patents, well, into each other and into patents, to have a whole chain of citations to trace local, national, and global spillovers. And so you can think of this as, if you can, through a methodology, what we do is we assign value to patents, and then a little bit of that value is assigned back to everything that has inspired it, directly or indirectly. So if an academic publication, think of COVID vaccines back in the 90s, has subsequently been cited by other publications and patents, which somehow ends up in something that made lots of money during the pandemic, that original publication gets a little bit of value of that in our methodology. And by doing that, you can see how different disciplines, how different universities, how different countries, the combination of those things actually can generate spillovers into global innovation, or into innovation within their own national boundaries, or even regions. And so we've so far applied this to clean technologies, and you could apply it to AI if you're interested in that, or any area, and you could apply it to regions. So you could say, okay, the university research in this region is, how much of that ultimately inspires patents in that same region, or are all the benefits going abroad? So I've nearly finished, and I think I'm about done with time. So here's just an illustration here of our application to clean energy. This is quite quite interesting now in the UK, a lot of discussion, as I said, about kind of the universities and the investment zones, but also about what is the UK's industrial strategy? Do we have an industrial strategy? And what's the green elements of that? So green industrial policy. And so here you can see which universities are contributing the most global spillovers into clean energy. Maybe it's not a surprise that Cambridge and Imperial and Oxford are up there. But what's interesting is there are, those are kind of golden triangle, as we call it, London, Oxford, and Cambridge universities. But there are many other universities up in Scotland, in the north of England, that seem to be doing well on these measures. And this actually supports the story for the UK, at least, that clean or a green industrial policy could actually help to address regional disparities, because a lot of the specializations are actually outside of London and the southeast, which has really pulled ahead in terms of its productivity, and there's a very big gap in productivity across these regions. So to conclude, I think that from different angles, this work suggests that universities have positive impacts on their regional economies. As I said, if there's anything that people want to talk more in detail about, I'll be very happy to do so. Some broad conclusions for policy that stem from this and the broader literature. I think university effects do tend to be stronger for more research-intensive universities or for places with higher absorptive capacity. So I think there's a path dependence at play here, and policy, when we're thinking about, where would we get the growth impacts out of every pound or euro or dollar spent of public money, we should support and build on actual strength. And maybe those strengths are kind of in already very successful areas, or maybe we could do more to find underlying strengths outside of those successful areas. But I think it's hard to simply be channeling R&D grants or support to places that don't have some underlying strengths already. But we need to improve access to the opportunities that would bring. So one of the issues in the UK is you might have real innovative clusters, and some of the people living quite close by might not be connected to the opportunities in those clusters. So how can you improve the opportunities through connectivity, through information campaigns? And then for the more lagging regions, it seems like there should perhaps be more of a focus on skills and diffusion in the first instance, and build innovative capacity to move to high levels of innovation perhaps later on. We need more research on the mechanisms and causality, and there are lots of papers out there that look at specific countries and do that. And I think also there's an important role here for policy experimentation and evaluation. So thinking, for example, about university and business collaboration, there's often various initiatives to try and improve that, but we know little in terms of what really works and in what conditions it really works. And finally, that there is a crucial role of university research in addressing the key socioeconomic challenges that we face, either locally in regions, nationally or globally, whether it's climate change, whether it's health, digital technology, the actual innovation, but also the role of universities in building resilience of people in the labour market to that technological change. So we have separate work looking at those issues too. So how do we target policy and support given all these different areas of priority, and also balance different policy objectives and trade-offs, because there are often trade-offs, even thinking between what might work best for national growth versus what might work best for regional growth. How can we balance those trade-offs and competing priorities? And that's my presentation done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and that was an extremely interesting presentation, and the suggestions are certainly extremely good, both for scholars and for policymakers, as you hinted at the end of your presentation. All right, now Daniele Checchi, you agreed to be a discussant, so the floor, so to speak, is up to you.
Thank you very much. Let me take my slides. There are very few slides, but just to recap some point for the discussion. No, how can I close this here? No, I don't want to get out.
Oh, I'm afraid he made the wrong move, but which shows that universities may have a very positive impact on their outside, but not necessarily on their inside. All right. Okay, Daniele, no, we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Now. Yes, now.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I didn't read your paper when it was published, but it was really a pleasure to read and to think about what are the issues that you raised. Basically, just to summarize for the discussion, what you do is you consider the university density and you study the effect on regional GDP using potential 4 channels. One is the increased supply of skilled labor. The second one, possible contribution via patenting. The third one, which you left out in your presentation, but it's quite interesting, and I would like to discuss about the possibility of a positive impact on democratic values. And finally, the easiest one is possibly effect on demand created by employed at the university and students on the local market. You find a consistent positive effect, even though it's not clear to me for how long, because I mean, the level estimation gives us an elasticity of 0.04, but given the dynamic estimation and the convergence, it would be interesting to know for how long the effect will last. In the discussion in our country, this issue is particularly crucial because opening of new university in the south of the country, it was often justified on the argument of creating growth engines that should have a positive spillover effect in the local economy, which I'm not aware of any detailed study like yours, but apparently they did not occur in the following years. Marino knows better than me that there are cases like the University of Benevento, just to quote one of the most famous, which apparently created job opportunities. So the demand effect obviously applies, but there are no other spillover on the non-existing productive sector there. I find that the main limit of your analysis here is that we don't have information on the quality of these universities. But more generally, thinking about opening a new university in a place where the university is absent, call for thinking about the mechanism of creating the university. And in order to have students, you need at least local secondary education. You may call back migrating students who were attending universities in other areas that may attend due to liquidity constraint or any other story, may be interested in having a local university. But you also need professors. Where do you take a new professor for a new university? I mean, given the scarcity of academics, it's not that easy. I mean, you can boost, as the Italian government has done at the beginning of the current century, hiring and selection procedure in order to have a new wave of professors due to the fact that there was an expansion of universities. But in any case, these take time, not to speak about infrastructure, classes, libraries. Now it's easy to start a digital library, but if you go back, let's say 50 years ago, one of the main features of a university were exactly the attractiveness of library. Think of the Bodleian in Oxford, or the of the Lionel Robbins, the LSE, which were among the best one in Europe. So I think that despite your experiment of 3 or 5 years of lag, I think that there is a dynamic process which is not exactly captured in your regression. Then thinking about the quality, you are unable to distinguish, obviously, to distinguish whether these universities are public or private, but public or private university do have a completely different set of incentives. I'm familiar with the Portuguese experience where there was a close number of access to the university on the student side, and suddenly a private sector was allowed to emerge, but the private sector is basically demand driven by enrollment of the students. So in thinking of the endogeneity of your regressors, if you were possibly able to separate, I would study the impact of public university only. Then there is an additional issue, which is university often, more university on the same territory, typically they do compete. They do compete because they compete for attracting professors. They do compete for attracting students. So one possible complement to your regression, which can be computed in your data, is to introduce an Herfindahl index of concentration. And I don't have a clear expectation where the sign could be positive or negative. In principle, if competition is an incentive for better quality university, the sign should be positive. But it's also possible that they split the market. So some university become STEM and some other become humanities. And so in any case, I think that is the paper is already published, but just to discuss for new ideas, the market interaction effect may be one potential additional channel of impact, because the final question is, because of your cost-benefit analysis, prove that there is a strong gain in opening new universities. Why we don't advise the politicians to make tertiary education compulsory, which would lead to the creation of many other universities. I know that the way in which you do cost-benefit analysis is just a suggestive, but as long as your research project prove true, then the obvious policy implication is expanding the university. So the European Commission, which called for having 40% of the young population with a tertiary degree by 2030, is definitely right. However, when I think in an anecdotal way to your story, applied to Italy, I find difficult to reconcile the model with the data. Here I just, in 5 minutes, ask myself what are the universities in the northwest of the country, which are basically Lombardy, Piedmont, and Liguria, which were at the core of the Industrial Revolution in Italy. And conditional on not forgetting any other university, these are the university I was able to recall. You have three very old universities, Pavia, Turin, and Genoa. If you look at the current stage of development, they are three regions or three wards, to use your county specification, which are now in trouble, despite their old university, because they were their regions were important during the industrial phase, but then they didn't follow the transition to services. Then 1 century ago, we noticed the emergence of two polytechnic, which were basically producing engineers. And these, the data are consistent with the wave of industrialization in this area. A private university, the red one are privates, emerged at the beginning of previous century, basically producing degrees in economics. It is noticeable that Milan, which is now at the core of the Italian GDP, saw the emergence of a state university just 1 century ago, so much later than it was due to the fascist government who wanted to have a university here. You have a gap of something like 40 years. The golden decade has already passed, and you saw the emergence of a second university in Bergamo, and then a second private university in languages, UM, and then the most recent one. So I find that, and you were kind enough to show the same graph for Italy, and you recognize that Italy is a strange case. Then let me go to the second paper. I was not able to read the one on skills, but I read the second one, which is on UK. Here you focus on a country such that you can use a very fine grain at the geographical level, and you correlate enrollment and firm productivity. Again, you find a positive effect, especially in the high-tech sector. Here, I must say that I'm dubious about the issue of causality. While in the previous paper, it was the sample was so large that and so varied by country and years. Here, I think that there are really risk of reverse causality. Think of which, I mean, you use a 3-year lag in enrollment to protect yourself against my objection. But if you think about a buoyant labor market attracting students because they are interested in the labor market, not at the university, you would find a similar correlation, especially if expectations take time to form. And so this is hard to buy. Using panel fixed effect obviously clear away the effect of time invariant institutions, but does not solve the problem for the generate. So here are some issues that I would like to listen to your reaction. The first one is what is the real potential causal effect? Is university and business in general, so we include all the consultancies and so on, or it's really just innovation and startup? Considering that there may be startup also in the general business, I am more inclined to believe that the innovation in startup is the core of your result. But then if my expectation is correct, then my second question is, why do you take enrollment and you don't take papers published by people who is affiliated to those universities? Because if there are innovation, there must be a paper counterpart of the innovation, and therefore, and this I don't think is very difficult to collect, because there are a lot of bibliometry database which can replace the students. You cope with the endogeneity issue using overseas student or a predicted overseas student. But I'm not sure that overseas students are really exogenous. I think that the overseas students have a disadvantage in terms of information. In thinking about how an overseas student can form his or her expectation about which university in UK to apply at, then I think that either he or she is looking at research impact, or is looking where the student, the native students are going. And therefore, if native students are endogenous, then overseas students may be endogenous as well. Then you have some heterogeneity check, and in particular, you focus on the Russell group. I don't know exactly who belong to Russell. I know that the top one are there, but then my suggestion is, if you want to check whether best university according to some criteria are more effective, then why you don't use the ref ranking? You may interact your measure of university presence with the ranking in the research assessment exercise. And finally, an heterogeneity I would be interested in seeing is London is a story by its own. It has so many business, it has so many universities, that I would like to see whether the story still holds when you remove London. And here I'm finished. Thank you for reading your paper was really interesting.
Thank you, Daniele. I think that we may see if there are other questions, and then unless Anna, unless you want to answer right away, but it's probably better if we collect other questions, if there are any. And then, let me remind the participants that if they have questions, they should write them. So then that we see them, and I can forward them to Anna. Just while we wait, if there are any questions, just one question by my. I found that your paper extremely interesting, because I mean it conveys ideas and suggestions that we find that are very widespread in the literature, but that are very seldom accompanied by data. And you, although there may be limitations, doubts on some data and so on, I think the value added here of your paper is the fact that there are some empirical support. There is some empirical support to propositions that are widely diffused, that are widespread, in the field of higher education, but that are rarely supported by data. So I really found it then very, very useful. I have a very curiosity, so to speak, but just one, since our webinar series is on universities and or higher education and metropolitan areas. My curiosity is the fact that in some, just to go very in a very anecdotal way, if I think in the United States, for instance, at some cities or metropolitan areas, which have more or less the same density of universities, I think that the economic impact is very different. Let's think of the San Francisco area on the one hand, or the Chicago area on the other one. I don't know precisely. I have collected no data. I may be wrong, but if from what I remember of the two areas, more or less they have the same density of universities. They are extremely, economically active regions in the United States, and yet the economic impact of universities in the Bay Area is far higher than the economic impact of universities in the Chicago area by probably all the indicators. So the question is, are there any other variables that we find in some regions and not in other regions that are associated to the presence of universities or to the density of universities that can help us explain why the economic effect is much stronger, is far stronger, or at least is different in a region than in the other? And if so, this would probably complement your view. I don't know whether it's clear. Okay, I of course could mention many other examples in Italy as well but I won't go longer than that. So are there any other questions? Not for the time being. So if you want to start answering the discussion and my question, Anna,
thank you so much. Yes, thank you both for your comments. Daniele, thank you for your very thorough comments and challenges. And I also wish that I had this presentation before we published the first paper, because I think you had some great ideas that we could have implemented at the time. I mean, as you say, the main limit is that we don't have size or quality or very good measures of those things consistently. And I think we're really honest about that in the paper and motivate kind of future work using better data in individual countries. Your comment about the gestation lag, I think, we do experiment with different lags. We also do just long differences. So at the region, we say over, say, 40 years or 30 years, growth of universities, growth in GDP without this complex kind of growth on lagged growth. We find consistent results in a sense, but what we argue in the paper is that doing our 5-year period is likely to understate the impacts, because you do expect these things to build over time. I suppose we are going with a founding date rather than when a university is first being planned. So usually when a university is founded, it has enough activity to say we're a functioning university, we're granting degrees. In the UK paper, I mean, for the international paper, we had to go with the founding date as given, which is often kind of what the university considers its formal founding date. Of course, universities change a lot from when they were founded till where they are today. In the UK one, I experimented with different ways of considering founding. So there was when it was first founded in whatever form, maybe it was a college which later was upgraded to university. I considered the original founding date, or I considered the date when it got the status of awarding degrees as the date. So you can do more things when you have richer data on that. But I think that's where actually having the size or the composition is useful, because then you can actually get at those things. What is the scale of this institution? Is it just really, really small? Would you expect it to actually have much of an impact? So this, yeah, because you mentioned the scarcity, how it can be hard to find the people to actually teach in these universities, etc. So I think I agree that this dynamic process is important. With the data we have, exploring different lag structures and long differences, as well as the growth on levels, I think we tried to argue in the end that we're probably understating the impacts with our methods rather than overstating. The public and private, that was a really good point. There was actually a variable. I was trying to remember why we didn't use it more. There was actually a variable saying whether university was public or private. I think it wasn't that informative when we did try to use it. And in many universities, there weren't really any private university. Sorry, in many countries, there weren't any private universities. But I agree, you're likely to see different effects for those different types of institutions, perhaps in individual countries or contexts where there's a real difference and there's many more private institutions. The competition, that was a really good idea. And again, that was something that we could actually put in. I suppose my prior would be, usually we know that competition is good for outcomes. So it also in education, when you have some spatial measure of competition, institutions tend to do better, but be very interesting to see. That would be maybe student outcomes, but what about the outcome for the place? Is it also more positive? So when you said about the strong gain, why not just make higher education compulsory? I suppose then that's because this is a gain based on institutions, which is a kind of lumpy thing, requires a lot of investment. An institution can grow. So you could say, why not just grow all the institutions? In other words, why not, as you said, have more people studying to degree level? I think then the literature you need to look at is more the individual returns to education and see whether for individuals there's still a premium. There are debates on this. In the UK, there are some people saying we need more graduates, and some of our work has definitely supported that. But there are other people who say we have too many graduates, we need more technical vocational education. I mean, in our work, looking at the skill premium, there's still a strong skill premium, and there's evidence that we could have more graduates, but we could also have more people at sub-degree level, but that shouldn't erode the graduates. That should be from taking more people who are currently leaving secondary school without enough kind of further or technical vocational sub-degree education. So we argue that we need to improve that. And knowing the UK context, that's what you see, that we actually do quite well in terms of how many people we have with degrees. There's still a degree premium, but we have too many people who have too low attainment overall. So the question you had about Italy and the showing the different universities, I guess, we are in, that's another maybe drawback of the data. It's all different countries. We try to look at individual countries, different continents. Are the results different? In general, we found that, I think there's discussion maybe in the appendix, we cut different continents or different regions by different periods and saw whether there's particular effects in some places or not. Overall, we were quite confident this is a general effect across all the places. But I think if we're looking at specific countries, it is probably worth then appealing to the literature, which I think chimes with Marino's point, which is why do some universities and some places get into this virtuous cycle and others don't? So then, in a sense, I would appeal, once my UK paper, which I'll get on into a minute, is in a better shape and hopefully published, I can address this in the UK. But I think there are these excellent papers in the US, which get at that. So Cantor and Wally and Naomi Hausman, I think what they show is that universities impact on economic outcomes and innovation outcomes, but it really does vary across two dimensions. One is the research intensity of the university and the human capital intensity. That's the Cantor and Wally paper. So you're more likely to, so it's like pre-existing conditions are more likely to generate success in a sense. And then for Naomi Hausman, it was when there's a closer proximity between the industrial makeup of a place and the research specialisms in the university. So if you have that proximity, then when you expand the innovation activity in a university, that's more likely to spill over, and that kind of makes sense. So I think that would be the kind of explanation I would have for your question, Daniele, about Italy, and also Marino, your question about San Francisco versus Chicago, without knowing more about the specifics of Chicago. Everyone talks about San Francisco and Silicon Valley, but I don't know the specifics necessarily on Chicago, but I suspect it's something like that. So on the UK enrolments paper, so I'm also dubious about the causality of the overall paper, which is why it's still in its form that it's in. But what we want to do is refocus it slightly. So once all the data are in a good shape on the productivity side, because that's the bit where I was using a productivity data set, which at the time they said they were updating, they still haven't updated it. I was also using the admin data on the firms. That bit, the high-tech startups thing, I'd be a little bit happy about than the productivity stuff. But it was the overseas students that I did this shift share instrument, which I think should get at your concern of our overseas students moving to places on an endogenous basis, because what we did was we took a base year composition of where students are by discipline, and then applied the national level inflows of overseas students by country. I mean, there are criticisms of shift share instruments, but that should get at like people choosing places because of their current economic outlook, in a sense. So it feels like that might be a more promising route to take the paper, to have more of an overall kind of causal interpretation, even though you lose a bit of the generality of the current links, which are university expansion in general and economic activity in general. So you were asking about whether, so your specific questions here, business university interaction or innovation startups. I suppose the startup stuff, that is the outcome being studied. So in that bit, it does seem to be startups. Maybe some of those are spin outs, and you can get the problem with the data in the UK. There are data sets where you can get specifics on whether firms are spin outs. It's quite hard to merge the data sets together. So there's a data set we're using for another project called Bohurst, which tracks all the high growth companies in the UK, including ones that receive venture capital or growth finance, and it tracks university spin outs too. But it's quite a process to try and get that data into the secure environment where you use the admin data. But what you could do theoretically is get that data into the secure environment and then see how many of these startups are actually spin outs, or how many of them are simply startups, which could be, as I mentioned before, it could be maybe a graduate of the university staying and starting up a company, or it could just be someone from elsewhere coming and starting a company because this place has favorable conditions, which could be partly the university, it could be other things too. You asked why students and not papers. I suppose because I was trying to, like, following the spirit of the global paper, it was like an overall measure of university presence in a place and taking the size as the dimension rather than the papers. Whereas if you wanted something more on university research and its innovation impacts, I think you would take papers. But the thing is that then in some sense, papers, particularly high quality papers, are not necessarily aimed at a local impact. They're perhaps more at the global frontier, maybe, you know, an economist researching Denmark because Danish data is very good, but economists in the UK, but that doesn't necessarily have, it's not geared towards the local impact in that region. And because that paper was very much about the local industrial makeup, I was using more this proxy of overall size, thinking, well, if you have more students, you need more professors. We had measures of PhD intensity, which gives you a measure of research intensity. And then the ref, I did actually use ref in the paper, not fully through integrated into the regressions, but I did do some cross-sectional correlations where I had the Russell as one measure of research intensity, and then distance to closest. So I had like dependent variable being things like number of firms, employment, or entrants, and then related that to whether the university is Russell Group, if that's positive. Also distance to the closest university interacted with 4-star research share. So that is something that I have the data, but I suppose I wasn't completely sure how to integrate it, because we don't have like a different ref rating for every year. You had one which was the RAE, the Research Excellent Exercise, something like a different one, and then the REF 2014. So I kind of looked at it more in a cross section, but that's something that I could explore for the next round, certainly. And actually, it's something we're using in that paper on the technology adoption as well, to understand the mechanisms of some of those skills to adoption relationships. And then excluding London, so there is a table where I just looked at heterogeneity across places and is it all driven by London? And I think dropping London makes the effect a bit weaker on the high-tech startups, not much. I think it's not sensitive to dropping Cambridge or Oxford. the result is stronger for the places with higher initial human capital. And I think it was stronger for urban places too. So I think that was your main questions, but let me know if I've missed something.
No, thank you. You have answered all the questions and suggestions.
Thank you, Anna. I have one question by Andrea Cavosto, who is the director of the Agnelli Foundation, which I'm going to read. Is online universities are growing fast in importance after the pandemic. In Italy, for instance, they have taken students away from southern universities. Would this be a natural experiment for your work? Online universities have no local impact. So if there is a channel into growth, this must be through accumulation of human capital, if any.
Yeah, that's a great point, particularly in places where actually lots of people are doing that route. So that's something to look at. Yeah, based on if you can have data on where people live and then they're enrolling into these programs and then relate that to economic outcomes. In a sense, that then is more the literature on human capital and growth rather than universities and trying to get at the mechanisms. But I suppose if you had universities and then you have the universities that are in places and the universities that aren't, I mean, in the UK, we have the Open University, which has been there for some time, distance learning. Or yeah, I suppose before the internet, people would be sent their materials. And I've tended to just exclude it from my analysis, but I think it's worth looking at these since online has become such a thing and obviously enabled by technology. That would be very interesting.
Okay, I can't see any other questions, so I think that we may end here. Thanking you, Anna, very, very much, because it was extremely interesting. And also thanks to Daniele. But again, it is, for in the overall framework of our webinar series, it has been an extremely interesting and important contribution that you gave to us today. And so thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna.
All right.
My pleasure to have met you.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Thank you to everybody, and bye-bye.